Here I was, chilling in my metaphorical puddle, when suddenly the meme phenomenon of Barbenheimer hit and I, after a long time, found myself being carried to the cinema once again. In short succession I watched both movies, and while I'd count myself in the target audience for Oppenheimer, for Barbie I was just clinging to the hope that it was more than a simple toy movie, as the trailer seemed to suggest. Oppenheimer was great, pretty much what I expected, and a movie one should definitely go and see on the big screen. However, imagine my surprise when I left Barbie not only positively surprised, but generally impressed by its concept. I checked with my friends, reflected on my state of mind, and came to the conclusion that, after all, I fairly enjoyed Barbie. Naturally, I went into the internet seeking affirmation, and boy was I surprised. Seems there are only two ways of viewing Barbie, and I didn't like both of them. See, one side seemed to love Barbie for being man-hating trash, while the other half hated it for the same reason, while in my personal viewing I didn't interpret it as man-hating at all. So, never expected to end up here, but here I go defending Barbie of all the movies. Without ado, here comes Barbie, A Lost Perspective. I'll start with a short but necessary summary of the plot, so obviously spoilers. We start in Barbieland with our protagonist, stereotypical Barbie, who lives in Barbieland, a manifestation of the children's play word for Barbie dolls, where all the iterations of Barbies exist in a non-ending cycle of party and celebration, convinced to have ended all the problems women had in the past by breaking social boundaries through their sheer existence. All the versions of Kens also exist, but they are just accessories to the Barbies and thus largely ignored. Then, one day, protagonist Barbie starts having thoughts about death and real-world stuff starts happening to her. So, she goes to Weird Barbie, the representation of the Barbie dolls that have been played to their limit, and Weird Barbie tells her that the girl playing with her is going through a rough phase and she has to go and find her in the real world to fix stuff. So she does, and stereotypical Ken comes with her because he needs to be with her. They arrive in the real world and turns out all issues have not been solved by the production of emancipated Barbie dolls, and they have a rough time adapting to reality and the exaggerated harassment and catcalling they are faced with. Barbie obviously is hit more by this clash of words, while Ken simply enjoys being recognized as a person for once. Eventually, protagonist Barbie remembers that she needs to find the girl that played with her, and Ken is sent away to not be in the way. Barbie has a vision of a girl growing up and subsequently finds that girl at her school. Turns out that girl is not a Barbie fan at all and hates her for portraying unrealistic standards. In fact, we find out that girl is not even the actual girl she's looking for, because that would be the girl's mother, a mid-level worker at Mattel. The mother recognizes her instantly when Barbie gets picked up by Mattel's patriarchy goons and follows them to the company's headquarters. Meanwhile, Ken is super impressed by the manliness of man in the real world and he stumbles over the concept of the patriarchy, embraces it fully as the best thing ever and returns to Barbieland when the patriarchy doesn't work out for him in the real world the way he expects it to. Around this time, Barbie is taken to the upper management at Mattel and is presented to Will Ferrell, the CEO of Mattel. He wants to put her in a box, but then Barbie decides otherwise and escapes due to the over-the-top incompetence of the suits at Mattel. The girl's mother picks her up and together they escape to Barbieland. Now we enter the final chapter of the movie, which, in my opinion, is the most memeable part of the whole thing. Turns out, Ken and his rudimentary interpretation of the patriarchy has overtaken Barbieland, turned all the Kens into over-the-top stereotypical male parodies of dudes, and the bland emancipated Barbie iterations have fallen to the Ken's idea of the patriarchy and become mindless partners to their Ken. Only Weird Barbie is left unaffected and protagonist Barbie has her darkest hour breakdown because the simplicity of Barbieland seems to be lost forever. The mother and her daughter try to escape from the emerging Kendom with Ellen, but on their way out they have a change of mind and return to fix things. They pep talk protagonist Barbie out of her miserable state and together they come up with a plan to re-establish Barbieland. They use the Ken's stereotypical behavior against them, distracting each Ken while they snap the respective Barbies out of the patriarchy mindset and have them join their plan for evoking envy in the Kens. This works out right as intended, resulting in a big distraction battle of the Kens, while the Barbies go and vote to re-establish Barbieland to its original state of an anti-patriarchy. So, Barbieland is re-established and the Kens return to find they missed the vote and lost the Kendom, but our trio of mother, daughter and protagonist Barbie tell them that they can be more than just accessories to their Barbie iterations and should go to find out who they are on their own. The Kens bring up equal rights in Barbie Land and it is laughed away. Mattel's CEO is persuaded to market normal Barbie, and stereotypical Barbie asks the ghost of Mattel's founder if she can become a real woman in the real world, which she can and does, returning with the mother and her daughter. So, what are the issues most critical voices seem to have with the movie? Well, first and foremost, it is quite apparent that the male characters are not portrayed as fully fledged characters, but as comedic elements more often than not at the butt of the jokes. This fits neatly with a lot of bad movies that have come out recently, and I think it is easy to see how this would lead to a lot of critical minds automatically slotting the movie into the same categories as those ones. However, people seem to miss that most of the female characters in Barbieland are portrayed in a similar manner, and I will dive into the exceptions within the broader story shortly. My main point would be that most of the issues people seem to have with the movie are actually solved within the setting and the world building concept behind the movie, which I'd argue is missed by most critics out there. So settle in, because here comes my interpretation of the world building of Barbie. If we reflect on the movie, the two main settings of our story are on the one hand Barbieland, a utopian reflection of the play world the Barbie dolls evoke in the minds of the children playing with them, and on the other hand the real world, an over-the-top representation of what the girls growing up face when eventually leaving the play world of their childhood and enter life as an adult. We, as the viewer, experience the world as stereotypical Barbie and arguably Ken, but both are part of the setting of Barbieland, which I'd argue never is portrayed as this perfect world we should all strive for, but as an simplistic and surface-level anti-patriarchy. If we then look at what the film portrays as the real world, we as viewers can hopefully agree that it is not actually the real world, as, apart from being comically exaggerated, some things majorly differ from clear facts that we know from our reality. There are elements that are somewhat reflective of actual experiences one might have, such as people's initial reactions to Barbie and Ken, laws and the consequences of breaking them, as well as unwanted attention and sexual harassment, which all do exist in our world. But then we encounter the board of the higher-ups at Mattel, which majorly differs from the real-world board, clearly chosen as a representation of the patriarchy. From the start, these men are portrayed as a bunch of childish and unprofessional clowns too incompetent to catch Barbie in their own company structures. This might seem inconsistent and offensive at first glance, but makes a lot of sense if you implement the world-building logic of the film. As established with stereotypical Barbies malfunctioning, the reality in the movie is influenced by the thoughts and experiences of the child playing with her. In our case, we find out that it is actually this grown woman, the mother of our initial suspect, reflecting on her growing up with Barbie. I would argue that when Barbie enters the real world, it is in fact not the real world, but the real world as perceived by the mother. Her memories are selective, so the harassment frequency is obviously turned up, and, working in mid-level management of Mattel, she has never met the higher-ups behind the ominous door of the boardroom, which she explicitly never passes. The only guy she actually knows personally would be this guy who hops from her level of mid-management to upper management, and who people seem to have a problem placing within the story. The mother believes in the patriarchy, so the patriarchy exists in our story world, manifesting where she has not personally been to, in the form as she sees the patriarchy as. If you view the characters in the movie from this perspective, the deviations from reality in the real world suddenly make a lot of sense. Interestingly, some people seem to think that the mother and her daughter don't really fit into the story and should have been left out of the movie as a whole. I'd say that's precisely the reason for that. If I'm correct, and that's what the director Greta Gerwig was going for, the only people that can somewhat be taken serious in the context of this movie's setting would be the mother, her daughter, and arguably her absent husband. Maybe even the guy from middle management. Everything else is just a representation of her crisis and conflict with the two constructs she's battling with in her head, namely her childhood's view of Barbieland and her adult self's view of the patriarchy. Stereotypical Barbie as our protagonist being the representation of this conflict. Of course, I could be completely wrong, and the whole movie I was pretty conflicted myself whether I was interpreting too much into it. But then, when Barbie explicitly decides to leave fake Barbie world behind to experience the real world as a real person, she has a talk with Ruth, the spirit of Mattel, and Ruth right out tells Barbie that both Barbie world and the patriarchy are made up concepts and she can do whatever she wants. Take from that what you will. Anyway, I think there's quite an interesting concept behind the movie, which I did not expect at all, and I think it should be seen as an intelligent reflection and critique of the history of the Barbie doll and the reality of girls growing up with conflicting ideas of the real world. While definitely not targeted at men, people seem to miss the point I think the movie is trying to make. I hope I was able to give an alternative perspective on the movie that hopefully helps to get the edge of the discussion around it. If you disagree, that's fine. You can always state your personal opinion on or interpretation of the movie in the comments. I, for one, am just happy we have not only one, but two original and reflective movies to enjoy at the same time. Cheers!